Okay, so let me introduce Libby Copeland. She is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as The Atlantic, Slate, New York, Smithsonian, and the New York Times, the New Republic, Esquire.com, and the Wall Street Journal. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, was published in March by Abrams Press. The Lost Family explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. So I'm going to turn it over to Libby and her program. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much, Barb. I appreciate it. And I'm happy to see everyone. So I wanted to talk a little bit about The Lost Family, a book that I started reporting about 3 years ago. It's my first book. I spent about 10 years at the Washington Post, and in more recent years became increasingly interested in science and culture and the kind of intersection between the two. The Lost Family sort of grew out of that. So I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit about it. So I want to start sort of by giving you a bit of a sense about the history of DNA testing, which some people know, although a lot of folks might not realize it's quite as old of an industry as it is. It actually just had its 20th anniversary in April. And that's because it was in April of 2000 that the very first company that was founded in the United States, a company called Family Tree DNA, sent out its first DNA test kits. Now, the type of DNA testing that was being done back in April of 2000 was very, very different from what's on offer now. It was Y-DNA testing, so it was looking at the male sex chromosome, and it was not able to tell you what the type of DNA testing that's so common now, autosomal DNA testing, can tell you. It was cruder, more expensive. It could tell you some information along a man's father's line. And there was also something called mitochondrial DNA testing that could trace an individual's mother's line. But it couldn't do what autosomal DNA testing can do, which is give you a sense of your relatives along both sides of your family and your immediate relatives. Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA testing, you often can't tell how closely related you are to someone. And so as far as family history research, the advent of autosomal DNA testing approximately 10 years ago was really a big deal. But I want to start by sort of telling you about how the industry started, because it includes a guy named Bennett Greenspan, who's a pretty good storyteller. I flew down to Houston to interview him for the book. And I've talked to him many times, and he's just this kind of, this major league talker who likes to tell stories. And he was a serious genealogist back in the 90s who was faced with this brick wall. And he was so sort of like fixated on fixing this brick wall, which, genealogists know as the sort of like problem you can't get around with paper records. It had to do with a relative in Argentina, and he was trying to figure out if the guy was actually a genetic relative. They shared there was a sort of a shared surname in both sides of the family, and he thought he might be a relative. And he couldn't figure out how to verify this relationship through any of the paper records. And he finally decided that he thought that like a Y-DNA test would be the thing that would tell him for sure if this guy was related to him. And so he called up a scientist whose name he'd seen on some research papers, and called the guy on a Sunday afternoon at his home, got the guy on the phone and said, "Hey, my name is Bennett Greenspan. I'm just looking to buy a DNA test kit." And the guy said, "That's not a thing. We don't sell that. I do research in the lab." And Greenspan was kind of like flummoxed for a moment, he told me. And then the scientist said something to him along the lines of, I get so many calls from crazy genealogists about like trying to get their hands on some DNA test kits in order to solve a problem. Someone ought to start a business. And he had a kind of a light bulb moment that this was going to be his business. And he basically said to the guy, I'm going to call you back with a business plan. And he did. And so what Bennett Greenspan envisioned was a product that was entirely for people like himself, which is to say serious genealogists. It was so incredibly niche that he told me when he went to conferences early on with this new product, he would try to convince other genealogists that this was going to be useful to them, and he couldn't. And he got sort of so desperate to kind of persuade them that he would go up to people at these conferences and he would shake their hands, and then without letting go, he would walk slowly backwards to his little cubicle in hopes that once he got them, closer to his actual product, they might buy it. So for the first basically 10 years of the life of this industry, this is a product that it was just for genealogists. It has a very narrow appeal. It's pretty expensive, and not a lot of people are doing it. And as I said earlier, autosomal DNA testing comes on the scene around 2009, 2010, 2012, depending on the company. And that really makes the difference. The big sort of moment in many ways is when Ancestry debuts its test in 2012. And Ancestry is a company that has a lot of resources and a lot of genealogical materials that you can subscribe to. And it's the kind of the magic of putting together these ethnicity estimates, which they're offering, the DNA cousin matching, which 23andMe had debuted, and the access to genealogical records. That's like the secret sauce. And the other piece of the secret sauce is that Ancestry DNA has a lot of money to put into advertising. So you see, if you look at 2016 alone, just in that year, Ancestry spent $100 million in advertising for its DNA test kits. In the following year, they spent another $100 million. And you see this remarkable rise in sales for DNA test kits, so that it goes from something that was, something for the serious, first for the most niche genealogist, then something for the serious family historian as the price begins to drop, but not necessarily, just the most hardcore hobbyists. And then it becomes something that really is for the casual consumer. And there's kind of like a famous ad that probably some of you have seen that I want to say debuted in 2015, 2016. That is a man named Kyle. And he says that he's done his DNA test kit through Ancestry DNA, and he's discovered that he's not who he thought he was, and he's trading in his lederhosen for a kilt. And you see him in one scene wearing lederhosen, and the next scene wearing a kilt. And this ad, which is so on the one hand, a little bit flattening of the experience, right? And we can talk a little bit about the different ways in which you can define ethnicity as experience versus genetics. So it's a little bit oversimplifying, say, of that man's experience, but it's also widely appealing because it's this idea that you're going to discover that DNA testing is this kind of act of self-discovery, and that you might discover something surprising, but fairly innocuous that's going to deepen your own understanding of who you are. And you start to see these kits from companies like Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, and Family Tree DNA, the sales really going up. And it becomes something that you buy as a gift for somebody for Christmas. You get it for your mom on Mother's Day. You get it for your dad on Father's Day. I got my first test kit from my dad for the holidays. And it becomes the gift you give someone who already has everything else. And this is a significant thing because in some cases there are kind of unexpected outcomes. There were really profound outcomes. There were really surprising things that we can learn about ourselves or about the past that we didn't even expect when we went into it. And that's sort of what my book focuses on. So I'm going to move to the next slide. So this is just to kind of give you a sense of the growth of this industry, which I think is important for context, because you're talking about a technology that very, very few people had familiarity with, even just like 5 years ago. And now we have significant buy-in from the American public. So if you look at this line, in 2013, you have approximately 1 million people in aggregate who've done DNA testing through one of these 5 major DNA testing companies. By 2019, when I was writing my book, it was 30 million. It's now 35 million. And there's been somewhat of a slowdown recently for a variety of reasons. Some of them privacy concerns, possibly some of them the fact that a lot of kind of the early adopters have kind of already been vacuumed up. But you still see the numbers going up, and you see the companies kind of pivoting to different offerings in an attempt to sell more kits and get more people in the databases. So of 35 million people, about 80% of those people are in America for, again, a variety of reasons. America is, a melting pot. A lot of people here tend to feel cut off from their roots. In a lot of places in Europe, for instance, people have a sense that they kind of know where they come from. They're like, I come from here. They're not interested in necessarily spitting and getting a pie chart that tells them where they're from, because they already know. But here, there's a lot of pressures of assimilation over the last few hundred years. And there's a lot of folks who will say, I don't know much about my great-grandfather or anything about my great-grandfather. I don't even know like where he came from or what language he spoke, or maybe he was from this area, but I'm not quite sure. And so there's often a great desire for people to test and sort of, as the Ancestry DNA ads put it, find out who you are. So if you think about 80% of the 35 million people in the databases, you're closing in on close to 10% of the American population, which is a significant thing. It means that most people know someone who's taken a DNA test kit, even if they haven't. And the pace of the change and the size of the database is important for a few reasons. One is that if you're looking to find your immediate family, so say you were adopted and the state that you live in restricts your access to your original birth certificate and any identifying information about your birth parents, but you very much want to learn their identities. And I should say adoptees were some of the earliest adopters of kind of genetic genealogy techniques of using DNA in order to find immediate family. In this case, it's increasingly easy to find a second cousin or closer match, because the databases are so large that chances are you're going to find someone who's relatively close to make your search easy. And if you can get a second cousin match, you can fairly easily use genetic genealogy techniques to trace your way to discovering who your genetic family is, your immediate genetic family. It used to be, even say 5 years ago, that finding a second cousin was a bit of a rarity. And nowadays, people test and they immediately find a half sibling, which is kind of a remarkable change. The other reason that the size of the databases is important is because a lot of people are surprised by what they find. They don't set out looking for their genetic kin, but in fact, they test on a lark. As the protagonist of my book did. They test out of a sense of curiosity, hoping to deepen their understanding of their genealogy, but not expecting a profound surprise. And you see that the companies at this point do kind of give you a warning. When you test, they'll say something along the lines of, you may discover relatives that you weren't expecting, or you may find out things about your family that you didn't know. And yet in my interviews, I found that the vast majority of the time, people don't expect that it's going to happen to them, which makes sense, because why would you expect that some key component of your life was all wrong, right? That you weren't told something really important about your genetic origins. It's just, it would kind of take a feat of an imaginative leap or a feat of cognitive dissonance that none of us are prepared to engage in. And in fact, you see that in the reactions that people have when they first get their results. A lot of times the first reaction is a bit of denial, like these results must be wrong. And they call up the Ancestry hotline and they talk to the customer service agent and they say, why is it saying that this strange man is my father? I know my father and that's not his name. And then the customer service agents have to kind of handle this. And they've become so used to these calls that they now have sort of special, elevated, sensitive inquiry customer service agents. That's companies like Ancestry, DNA, and 23andMe, just to answer these kinds of questions. So very few people go into this sort of expecting a surprise. And yet the statistics simply apply to all of us, whether or not we expect them to. And that goes to why it really matters that we talk about DNA testing, because all of us are increasingly implicated by this technology. So what kinds of surprises are people getting in the databases? There's a vast kind of range. The most common significant kind of revelation of DNA testing kind of goes into two pockets. One is what's called an NPE. An NPE stands for a non-paternity event, or not parent expected. And if you haven't heard the term NPE, you soon will, for sure. It's become such a common term. It kind of comes out of the genealogy world, but it's become now almost kind of mainstream for people who've done DNA testing and found out that they're not related to one or both of their parents. It's typically the experience of discovering you're not genetically related to your dad. And it's so common that if you look on these Facebook groups, which there are many, many Facebook groups for every kind of experience of DNA surprise, you know, for instance, NPEs or adoptees who are searching using DNA, or foundlings who are searching using DNA, donor-conceived folks who are using DNA to understand their genetic families. If you look on these groups, you'll just see the phrase NPE over and over. I'm an NPE, you know, or my sister just discovered she's an NPE. We have a different dad. Or, you know, what is, you know, I have to talk to someone about what it feels like to be an NPE, because nobody I know has had this experience. So it's almost become this strange, modern, reductive form of identity that I am an NPE, this idea of it. And it's just so common that I really think, you know, now it's kind of shorthand that's a bit arcane, but it's increasingly going to be something that is a familiar term to Americans in general. The other kind of major bucket of unexpected revelation is just discovering that you have a previously unknown sibling or half sibling. And that can be because your dad isn't genetically related to you, but it can also be because, for instance, your dad maybe helped conceive a child before you were born, or your mom had a child before you were born, and maybe that child was adopted out of the family. So, so that's those are kind of two major buckets. There's the experience of discovering that you're adopted, or being adopted and using DNA in order to find your genetic family. Generally speaking, these days, most people know that they're adopted, and increasingly open adoption is the norm. But you do see cases, and I write about in the book, in particular, the experience of a woman named Linda, who does a DNA test and discovers that way that she is adopted. And it is a profoundly jarring thing to discover at the age of 51. Her mother is alive, the mother who raised her siblings are alive, and she's got to then reconcile with them that they never told her, and that she's got genetic kin on both sides, right, on her maternal and paternal side, that now she's got to try and figure out if she can have relationships with. It's absolutely transformative experience to enter into when you are merely doing it to get a little bit of medical information, or merely doing it to have a fuller sense of your ethnicity. Another bucket of people are those who are donor conceived. So if you've read Dani Shapiro's Inheritance, you know that many, many people, particularly, 50, 60 years ago, were conceived using donor sperm and then never told about that. That certainly happens to a lot of people. I've heard stories about instances where adult children have to inform their mother that she's donor conceived, which is, sort of a wild thing that none of us could have expected, and a kind of a bioethical thing, sort of situation that they have to struggle with. There are also cases where people know they're donor conceived, but they don't know quite how many half siblings they have. And what's interesting about DNA testing is that it has brought to light kind of the practices of another technology. So one technology kind of colliding with another technology, which is the fertility industry. The fertility industry doesn't have any restrictions on the number of children that a donor can help conceive. So there are cases of sprawling genetic networks with between 100 and 200 half siblings, if you can imagine. And many of them are discovering one another through these DNA databases. So if you can imagine the experience of, I'll give you an example of this. There's a woman I write about in the book. Her name is Ricky Lewis. And she's a geneticist. She has a PhD in genetics. And she is somebody who has written about commercial genetic testing and also DNA surprises for a long time. So she's someone who's sort of so familiar with this topic that you wouldn't expect that she could be surprised by a family secret. But of course, as I said earlier, no one imagines it will happen to them. So she does a DNA test and she actually discovers that she's donor conceived, which is a total surprise to her. And her parents are no longer alive. She doesn't have the ability to ask them about it. But at first it just appears that she has one half sibling, and then she has another, and then she has another, and then she has another. And the last time I talked to her, I think she had 6. And the numbers keep trickling in. I write in the book about another woman who discovers she has 22 half siblings. So these kinds of experiences raise all kinds of questions about, what is family? What kinds of relationships do I want with these people? What even is the lexicon, the terminology for these siblings? Do I call them siblings? Do I call them dibblings for donor siblings? There's all sorts of debates about what language should be used, and people feel strongly about them, the language. And so that's sort of another big bucket that's very important. A fifth bucket of DNA surprises is connected to those people who didn't know their genetic ancestries because those stories were hidden from them for reasons of discrimination or assimilation. And I'll talk a little bit more about one of those in a few minutes. And then I have this sort of 6th bucket that I call and more. And the and more is just like all sorts of things, right? NPE rates are generally considered to be about 2% per generation. So according to the best research I can find, about 2% of people don't know the identity of their genetic father, or they're surprised to discover it's someone other than they thought. But if you look at it, it goes back by generations as cumulative. So the and more bucket would account for, say, discovering that you're not genetically related to your grandfather. Or it would account for the experience of a woman who works at Ancestry who told me about finding out that she had a genetic first cousin through the databases. This was somebody who had been adopted out of the family. She said, I discovered that my family is amazing at keeping secrets. We're the kings of keeping family secrets. I had no idea, right? And again, this is someone steeped in family DNA surprises who didn't expect that would happen to her own family. So how common are these kinds of experiences? It's really hard to say because, as you can see, it's even an issue with definition. There's all these different kinds of buckets of experience, and the companies don't collect data on this. But if you look at just the 2 sort of most common scenarios, so discovering you're not genetically related to your dad, or finding out you have previously unknown half siblings or siblings, that is probably in the low single digits, conservatively speaking. Across a database of 35 million people, you're talking well over 1 million people who've had this kind of experience. But of course, there's many other kinds, so the bucket is much bigger. And then if you look at the way a single secret that's discovered refracts across a family unit and across another family unit, you're talking many, many more people. So if, for instance, someone discovers that they're not genetically related to their dad. That has implications not just for them and not just for the man that raised them, but also for that person's mother, also for the person's siblings who are now found to be genetically at least half siblings. And then there's a whole family somewhere 10 miles away, 100 miles away that now is also affected by this, right? If the person reaches out, they've got their genetic father, their genetic father's wife, and then their genetic father's children who are now newfound half siblings for the person who tested. So a single revelation has the power to affect, say, between easily 8 and 10 people. So you are talking about millions of Americans who are right now, often in an unprepared fashion, usually in an unprepared fashion, spitting into tubes because it costs $69 and finding out that they are not who they thought they were, or their families are not who they thought they were, or that somebody didn't tell them something really important about themselves or about a sibling. And we're all kind of going through this right now. And I think it's a major seismic cultural change for Americans. I think it's something we need to be talking about and discussing and researching and normalizing. Anyway, I just think it's a really big deal. The other thing I'll say about this is that there's a kind of a culture clash that happens. If you look at some of these categories, NPEs, for instance, or adopted people, donor conceived, there are these stigmas that existed 50, 60 years ago that are no longer as taboo as they were, or if they even are taboo anymore. But secrets have a kind of a circular logic, which is to say they kind of get stuck in, get stuck in amber. So once a family decides to kind of keep a secret based on the mores of 1952, say a young unmarried mother has to not tell anyone that she had a child and gave that child up for adoption. She never even tells her husband when she marries her husband. And now here it is all these years later, and we're in a completely different culture. We're in a culture in which everyone's telling their story. Lots of people are writing memoirs about their DNA testing surprises. And you have a kind of a clash of the culture of transparency against, a radically different culture. A culture so different, the culture of the past, that it's like a different country. And it's the clash of those two worlds that can be so painful, so interesting, and tell us so much about how much American society can change in just a few decades. The reason I sort of show this image is just to kind of give you a sense. You've seen 1,000 pedigrees, and they're much better than this one. This is just an image I pulled off of Flickr. But what I'm trying to illustrate in this image is that the size of the database, the 35 million, is important because not only because for sort of all the people who are spitting into vials and discovering that there's some secret in their family they didn't know about, but also because you don't need to test in order to be affected by this technology. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of this technology, because we share, of course, these overlapping genetic segments, which means that my decision to test implicates somebody else I'm genetically related to, even if they never choose to test. So for instance, let's say that in a theoretical example, my brother conceived a child when he was 17 and in high school. And let's say he never even knew he conceived a child. Then 30 years pass and DNA testing comes along, and I decide I'm doing family history research. So I spit into a vial and I test. That child, if that child is looking for that child's father, which is my brother, that child's going to find me as their genetic aunt. And that means that then I am forced with the decision as a kind of I'm made into a sudden bioethicist, right? I'm faced with the decision of whether to tell my brother. That child, is talking to me. I'm like not even sure what to say because I never knew my brother had a child in high school. And, you know, the point is that increasingly we all have to think about this technology, because whether or not you test, you're probably going to be implicated in it in some way. If there's a family secret in your family, a genetic family secret, it's going to come out. It's not a question of if, but when. And so we all need to be thinking about the questions that are raised by DNA testing, and the right ways to treat each other, and the right ways to kind of get through this, what can be very sticky situations. And I think the other reason that it's important that we all think about DNA testing, whether or not we've tested, is because it raises essential human questions, right? What is family? What is ethnicity? Are these things about experience? Are they about biology? You know, can you discount one in favor of the other? And I explore a lot of those kind of questions, which are in many ways philosophical, in my book. But I think that they're things that we've thought about since we were human. These are not new questions that human beings wrestle with. It's simply that DNA testing kind of makes them more dramatic and brings them to the fore. So how did I come to write this book? It basically started with a genetic detective mystery, a kind of a whodunit that I wrote for the Washington Post in 2017. And the woman in this picture is Alice Collins Playbuke. She has an astonishing story that came about when she tested in 2012 through Ancestry when the test was still in beta. It got unexpected results, but it took her on a 2.5-year journey. And her story has so many twists and turns and such a surprise ending that it's not like most DNA testing stories that you hear. And when I kind of heard her story, I thought it was astonishing and I wanted to write it, and I wrote it at considerable length for the Washington Post. In the wake of Alice's story running, I got very quickly over 400 emails from people who wanted to share their own DNA testing stories. And these stories were astonishing. They ran the gamut of all sorts of experiences. And when people reached out to their genetic families, the results were really varied. Some were heartwarming stories of embrace, some were heartbreaking stories of rejection. And I realized I wanted to write a book. And for this book, what I wanted to do was I wanted first to go back and tell Alice's story more fully. I wanted to fly out to Washington State to meet her. I wanted to crawl around inside her amazing analytical brain, because she's sort of like she basically is a hacker of her own DNA. And that's basically how she spent years solving her case, was basically by hacking and creating a database of her own DNA. It's absolutely astonishing. And I wanted to go back 100 years to tell the beginnings of her genetic mystery, with stuff that I wasn't able to do for a newspaper article. And then I also really wanted to tell the stories of people who had contacted me or who I had found in my reporting, who were telling me other kinds of stories. And I wanted to kind of do a 360 of some of these family situations and really give a sense of the variation of ways that these stories can play out, and the intimacy, the psychological intimacy, the emotional repercussions of discoveries like this. So there's been a ton of media coverage. If you read the Wall Street Journal, they've had like a series running for a few years now on this wonderful series by Amy Marcus on DNA testing surprises. Bloomberg reports about them, the New York Times. There's been Pew Research looking at this. There's just been an enormous amount of coverage of DNA surprises. But I wanted to kind of dig deeper. I didn't want to just tell stories that could be told, with kind of, rapid happy endings, but rather talk to people over the course of months and years and really get a sense of how this changed their orientation on the world, and give a sense of how nuanced and how gray these experiences can be. When people are disappointed by their genetic kin because their genetic kin don't want to know them, it's interesting to find that they are often still quite glad to know the truth about themselves, almost always, I found. And the happy ending stories can be also bittersweet. So these stories are not flat, they're not simple, they're very complicated. And I really wanted to sort of sit with people over the months and process them and hear how these stories developed. because like, again, I think this is a very important experience, and I think we're sort of just at the margins of understanding it. So I talk about the book, you know, the people in the book who kind of fall down the genealogical rabbit hole where they're trying to understand their history and their genetic origins to understand themselves. I refer to them as seekers. And I refer to the people who get contacted on the other side as the seekees. As I write in the book, you know, the sort of act of discovering that, for instance, your genetic origins aren't what you thought is really the very beginning of the story. It's everything that happens after that's the real journey. And that's the thing that can kind of go on for years and years. The discovery that you're not who you thought. So for instance, that you're not related to one of your parents, for instance, can often be very traumatic. It can lead to a sense of dislocation. It can kind of threaten your personal narrative because you have a story of yourself. We all do. And it's very hard to tell your own story when you don't know the beginning. And so it throws people's lives into real, you know, real dislocation and disorientation. And yet at the same time, it can very often answer questions they've had forever. It can mean that they're waking up in the middle of the night, suddenly remembering something that happened when they were 6 that suddenly they can see in a different light and makes sense. And so, as I said earlier, very often people will say they're glad to know the truth about themselves, even when it's really complicated. And on the other hand, the people on the other side, those who are being contacted, particularly if they've been keeping a secret for a long time, they're not always eager to be found. And there's sometimes, unfortunately, a great clash between the interests of two people who are intimately genetically related and just meeting each other for the first time or communicating for the first time over Facebook Messenger or certified letter, or however they chose to communicate. And one person really wants the relationship and one person really wants to shut it down. And those stories are very poignant and they're very real. And we need to be talking about those too. The last slide I wanted to show is just sort of a bit, this is just a bit of an overview of some of the research that's being done. And as you can see, you know, we're at the beginnings of this, there's lots more. And I think that this is going to be like a very fruitful area in years to come. How people think about race and ethnicity, for instance, in genetic terms, is a very interesting topic and one that's being explored. Scholars are particularly interested, sociologists have been studying, trying to figure out if this makes people sort of more convinced of genetic difference, or because they're seeing the diversity within themselves, more sort of more united in their brotherhood and sisterhood with their fellow human beings. And that's something that sort of the jury's a little bit still out on that. It's definitely still out on that. But there's a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania named Wendy Roth who's been studying this. There's a professor named Anita Foman at Westchester University in Pennsylvania who's been studying this. Does an ethnicity chart reinforce our sense of racial difference, or does it make us recognize our commonalities? There are questions about nature versus nurture. Are you the ethnicity you were raised? Or are you your genetic ancestry as revealed by a DNA test? And that's something that Alice, the protagonist of my book, and her 6 siblings wrestle with, because she discovers that rather than being entirely from the British Isles in her ancestry, mostly Irish American, that in fact she's half Ashkenazi Jewish. And she comes from a large Irish Catholic family. There's 7 siblings, and each of those siblings has a different answer to the question of who are you after that test. And I think that's very interesting because I think it speaks to the fact that there's a great diversity of opinion in how we interpret these tests and how much we take them to heart and what we make of them. There's also the questions about family, right? Is family a lifetime of interactions or an experience, or is it biology, or is it both? What kind of relationship do you want to have with your bio dad, and how does that alter your relationship with the man who raised you? How should it alter that relationship? These are all questions I explore, and I think, you know, I think these are really compelling stories of people who are essentially on the horizon of a new experience in which technology is profoundly reshaping the American family. And I'm hoping from some of the stories that I hear that are kind of optimistic that it's moving us away from kind of a binary thinking in terms of nature versus nurture, I am this or I am that, and towards a more expansive view in how we think about family and how we think about ethnicity. So I will stop talking there because my watch tells me it's time, although I could go on and on. But I will say that if you are interested in learning more about The Lost Family, or you want to buy copies, Barb tells me that she has them at the local library, and you can also buy it on Amazon. But if you want to support local bookstores, which is something I've been trying to do during this pandemic and these hard times, there's a website called bookshop.org, and they are a consortium of independent bookstores. And if you buy from them, they will ship to you, but it will be from a bookstore like that. And that's a really nice thing. And the last thing I'll say is if you want a signed copy, because you want the experience of having been at a book signing, even though we can't actually be together anymore, you can call the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York. So the Village Bookstore in Pleasantville, New York is not far from me, and I can go there and you can ask for Jennifer. She'll take care of this. I will go there and sign a copy to you or to whoever you like, and they will ship it to you. So that's it. And I appreciate you all listening to my long rambling talk.
Let's, could we end the?
Yeah, I'm gonna end screen sharing. Hang on, let me just do that. Is that better?
Yes, and then I can put,
there we go.
do that. I'll put in the chat the information about the bookstores you just mentioned.
Right. You know, I see a question here. I can answer it while you're doing that, if that
Okay.
makes. So the question I got is, are you assuming that DNA testing is 100% accurate? It is my understanding that it is not. There's a margin of error. So that's a good question. You know, when you're talking about ethnicity, there's definitely a margin of error. Ethnicity estimates are an evolving science, and they are not perfect. And anyone who has tested it more than one company knows that. I used to have 1% Korean, and I spent months trying to figure out where my Korean ancestor in the 1700s could have intersected with my Ashkenazi Jewish forebears on my mother's side. Before that, 1% Korean was downgraded to 0.1% South Asian and then disappeared altogether. So for sure, there's imperfections in the science of the ethnicity estimates, and that has to do with reasons. The major ones being that each company has its own algorithm and each company has its own reference population, and so they differ. And they're, you know, they're estimates. They're not perfect. When it comes to relative matching is really solid science. There can be distinctions if you come from a community that's endogamous. So if there's a lot of cousin marriage, there can be instances where cousins that are actually quite distant look a little bit, it inflates the relationship predictions. So a sixth cousin could look like a third to fourth cousin maybe. And that's definitely a problem for Ashkenazi Jews and other populations as well. British colonial, I have that on my father's side, so I have endogamy on both sides, but there's plenty of populations that have that. But aside from that, those anomalies, the relationship matching is really quite solid.
Libby?
Question here. Can you speak a little bit about how DNA is being used to solve crimes, especially cold cases?
Yeah, absolutely. And after that, I want to, because I think we have a special guest star today who is starting to ask me a question, and I want to make sure I got her in too, if I have it right. So everyone's familiar probably with the Golden State Killer case. That case actually was broken open in April of 2018, and Joseph James D'Angelo, the suspect, pled guilty just this summer to over 13 homicides. And I think he's believed to have committed at least 50 rapes. And that was the first instance where law enforcement used DNA that had been gathered by genetic genealogy databases, genealogy databases, for the purposes of family history research, and put into kind of a third-party website, private site, sort of a private business that ran a quasi-public site called GEDmatch. And they used that, the crime scene DNA to figure out his identity by matching that DNA to distant cousins and unraveling his identity using complex genetic genealogy techniques that adoptees have been using for like almost a decade. So it's very interesting that first that these techniques were pioneered for and used by adoptees, and then it suddenly was used for this totally different purpose. Most Americans had not heard that you could do this until they read about it with the case of the Golden State Killer. And that kind of led to a kind of a revolution for law enforcement for the kind of worst of the worst cold cases that they've been unable to solve for some of them since going back to the 1950s or even longer. So these are cases of unidentified bodies or cases of crime scene DNA where the case was never able to be solved, and now using these genealogy DNA databases they can. And it kind of led to these privacy debates over whether this was a violation of the Fourth Amendment or not. And it's been really interesting to watch it happen, because I think at this point it's been used in over, I want to say 200 cold cases. The FBI has been using these techniques, and local agencies have been using them as well. And it's not something that happens in the databases of most of the major companies. So Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage say that they're closed off to law enforcement, and law enforcement could get like a warrant. And even then, in many cases, they say they would fight them. But this is GEDmatch, which is, again, this kind of publicly accessible database, a third-party database, and Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest database and has been working with the FBI. And I think, Alice, were you going to ask a question or say something?
I was going to say something.
Okay.
Can
So
you
this
hear
is
me?
Alice, who's from my book. She's the star of the book. I'm very pleased that she's here. Hi.
Hi. I just wanted to say, when people say that the matches aren't accurate, there are only a few matches that you can really tell what the relationship is with certainty. You can tell parents and children, but you can't tell if it's the parent or the child. You can tell brothers and sisters. That you can tell. It's the one, it's straightforward. But once you start getting into half siblings, a half sibling shares the same amount of DNA as let's say an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent. And a lot of people think, hey, they're saying my first cousin's my aunt, and she's not. Well, statistically, they share the same amount of DNA. And so you can't tell exactly which it is, but you can tell it's one of these. So I just wanted to
That's a
make
great
that
point.
clarity.
The degree of relatedness is predictable, but not the type of relatedness in many situations. Is that a good way of putting it, Alice?
Yeah. By the way, today's my father's 107th birthday.
Oh my gosh, that's
Well,
amazing.
yeah.
Wow.
Alice-
Alice's father figures prominently in the book. And I never met him because he died a long time ago, but he was an amazing man.
Her story is worth reading the book for. It's very interesting, Alice. I appreciate your cooperation with this. Very interesting.
It was fun.
I have a question here. It says, Libby, when you spoke with any of the managers of Ancestry or 23andMe, did you sense they took any ownership of all the angst people who are new NPE are enduring? Do you feel that their disclaimer is enough to warn folks? Do you feel they should have counselors? I think they may have started this, but not sure how thorough their experience is for NPEs. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I was struck in 2019, like right at the end when I was writing my book, 23andMe debuted this new page that was like, here's what you should know about managing unexpected relationships. I think it's called Managing Unexpected Relationships. And that was the first time that I've seen a company kind of straightforwardly address this in an official way on their website. But what the recommendation was that you should hire a therapist from BetterHelp, or one of the other online therapy programs. And their point is right. Like, sometimes you need support. And I think one of the things that I keep, banging my head against, thinking people really need, support for these situations, and psychologists should be prepared to help people through these unique situations, because they're not like other situations. And there is starting to be a growing community of psychologists who are specializing in this, often because they discovered themselves that they were the product of an NPE, and they said, oh my gosh, I've got to help other people through the situation. But as far as the companies go, I think the problem with the disclaimers, as I said earlier, and as I've noticed over and over, like, no one thinks it's going to happen to them. Why would you? So the disclaimer is good. I'm glad it's there. And 23andMe, for instance, has like multiple steps and places where you'll see this disclaimer. Ancestry has them too. I don't know if they do it quite as many times. And Ancestry now has a page as well with support and resources for people. But I mean, I don't know. I think this is a really big question and a really big need. And it's definitely a bigger need than is being met at this point. Let me see.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi.
Hey, this is Alicia from Seattle, Washington.
I know. I'm so excited to see.
Everybody, glad to be here. Thank you for answering that question. Just so everybody knows, I created a nonprofit here in Washington State, and we're actually just beginning to work on the counseling part of things. It's called Right to Know, but we're starting to now put together for hopefully over the whole United States at least to help people, because you're right, we have like a collective group of maybe 5 or 6 people in our private groups, and that's it. I mean, there's a lot of counselors out there, but it's just getting them the knowledge, what you have in your book and what you talk about, so they can work with people that have these really unique issues. And as you said, it's just a growing, I guess the percentage wise now is something like 2% of the population, maybe.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, there's a great psychologist named Krista Driver at Mariposa Women and Children's Center in Orange County, California. Anyway, it's a counseling center, and she discovered, that she was the product of an NPE, and I interviewed her for the book, and she talks about this idea that it is a trauma. It's a trauma. And, some people have a long time to process it, but increasingly what's happening is you go from discovery to knowing exactly who your relatives are, like within an instant. It all happens at once. So it's a very sudden thing to have happen. And it's not like you're noodling over it for months. Why does it say I'm half this? It's like, oh, it says I'm half this, and this is my genetic father right away. And she talked about the stages of the experience from her point of view, denial, anger, guilt. She felt anger at her, she talked about people feeling anger at their parents, and then guilt for feeling angry at their parents, right? And then anxiety at the loss of identity, and a kind of a sense of having missed out, particularly in her experience, relationships she could have had if she had known. And a lot of people have talked to me of this, of like, what if phenomenon, like what if I had known? It's just, it's, as you know, right, better than me, it's a complicated experience. Somebody asked, what DNA companies did I test with and how did the results differ? 23andMe and Ancestry and Family Tree DNA, and I just never got around to uploading it MyHeritage, but my mom did, so I feel like we have some, sense of that database too. And yeah, I mean, obviously the results differ in a couple of ways. One is that you're not going to be matched to someone if they're not in the database. So if you have a relative who's at Ancestry, they're going to show up as your first cousin at Ancestry, and they're not going to show up in 23andMe because they didn't test there. So yeah, that in that sense, but the ethnicity results for sure as well. you know, the amount of Scandinavian I am varies greatly, which I cannot understand, because I know what it should be based on my great grandmother having been Swedish. You know, the Ashkenazi Jewish is very easy to see. It's like a solid number that doesn't change. I think it's very different from the other. But once you get into this, you know, French, German, British, you know, Western Europe, there can be a lot of distinctions in exact percentages when you get to that granular level of detail. Yeah, I don't know, Barb, did you want to, I'm looking at this. I don't know if anyone wants to jump in or if I should keep answering questions from the chat, or you want to cut in.
Does anybody have a question live, or we'll ask another one from the chat?
I've got a question.
Yeah.
As I've done my ethnicity, primarily through Ancestry, over the years, I've gone from very heavily Middle Eastern, Yemeni to be specific, till now I got one last month because of updates on their tools, etc. I'm 1% Yemeni or Middle Eastern and 25% Italian.
Well, I know what I've read from Ancestry is that they've changed their algorithms a couple of times.
Right, yeah.
Over the last years. I took mine in 2014, and mine came back with like 40% Scandinavian. I don't have a single person in my tree going back 7 generations. And that didn't make any sense to me. And then they recalculated everything a couple years ago, and now it's much more in line with, you know, what my real ethnicity is from my research, which I, you know, rely on much more heavily than these pie charts. So that's part of it. And I think that Ancestry explains it as essentially for some people, it goes back to the Vikings, which is, you know, multi-centuries ago. And, you know, the fact that they went from the southern tip of Africa all the way up through, you know, the North Pole essentially, and left their genetics behind all the way throughout history. So I have Greek and Italian that has a high percentage too, and I don't have any in my family. So I just sort of disregard it just because of that. It's not explainable to me with my research, so.
Yeah, I think I interviewed Barry Starr, who's one of the chief scientists at Ancestry, and he said, you know, it's dead easy to tell continents apart. So you're not going to confuse someone who is from East Asia with someone from sub-Saharan Africa, right? But once you start getting into those little distinctions, there's countries with histories of war and migration and porous borders. It can be very difficult to tell one country from another. It also varies depending on what time frame you're looking at. Is it 500 years ago? Is it 1,000? And he said, you know, there's no such thing as like an Iberian SNP or a German SNP, right? It's all a question of interpretation. So in theory, it should get better as time goes on, but I can't speak to your precise experience or tell you whether it's gotten better for you or it's reliable.
Now, my comment concerning accuracy came not from my experience, but someone who I was talking with. I know of identical twin sisters who both did the DNA testing through Ancestry DNA, and the results that they got back were different. So, and I'm not sure, this was, you know, several years ago, so maybe the updates, if they did it again, would correct it or whatever. But they were astonished, being identical twins, that there would be any difference between them.
Yeah, there was a case that was reported on this too. It makes some sense when you talk to the scientists and they can kind of explain why that is. But you know, they're using these algorithms that are kind of trying to smooth out the results and make judgment calls. And they can make the wrong call. And it can look like you have a little bit different, you know, this or that. And yeah, you know, it can be jarring.
It made me change my mind about doing the Ancestry DNA and choosing another one instead.
So you're thinking you were going to do Ancestry and now you're going to do a different one?
Well, I did the 23andMe.
So I would say that all of the companies have this. There's no, I mean, there's no way of kind of opting out of the fuzziness of the ethnicity estimates. And people will say this company's better for this ethnicity and this company's better for that. But, you know, a lot of people decide it based on just the pure database size if they're looking for a genetic kin. But for sure, it's like the combination of the DNA with the paper records, right? That is going to tell you. You can't just do the DNA and hope that it will tell you everything, because you need the paper records and the research to augment it.
Yeah, I was surprised when I got the results back, because I've been doing my family genealogy for 20 years and have pretty much everybody back, you know, as far as I could go, which is late 1700s. And in the 23andMe, it came back with a small percentage of Swedish in the mix someplace. And I thought more about, well, my family's from Poland, and Poland has changed. I mean, for 123 years, more recently, there was no Poland, at least as far as political recognition of it as a separate country. But going back in history, there was a point in time way back when there was an invasion from Sweden. So I just kind of write it off to, well, back before the records that I can trace, perhaps one of those Swedish Vikings that the other person there was talking about that passed through, left some genetic material behind in our family.
I mean, part of this is the problem of using contemporary nation state definitions and contemporary borders.
Yeah.
When those borders and definitions and names didn't exist 500 years ago.
Or it was ruled by, the borders had changed, so that part of their country was under a different rule.
Right. Yeah.
Did you see the question? How do companies determine the ethnicity and countries of origin? Are you able to address that?
Yeah, sure. So it's as I was saying earlier, there's the main two factors are the algorithm and the reference population. So the reference population are the people who are supposed to stand in for all of Norway, right? And if you have 5 people in that reference population, if you had a really crummy DNA testing company with only 5, which you wouldn't, there's more. But let's say, better example, if there's 100, you're not going to get as fine detail, as granular results, as good results as if you have 500 people standing in for the reference population of Norway in this example. And so the reference population really matters. And when you look at there are some countries with really small reference populations, even though the population of that country is very large. And so it can't really account for the diversity of that country, and it can't. What a lot of people. So basically, the databases tend to skew European American. They tend to skew for white folks and give really granular results. So they can tease out, whether you're from you know, how far west in Europe you are, right? Whether maybe in theory, you know, whether it's France or Germany, they might be able to tease out. Although 23andMe can't, the last time I checked. But if you're from, you know, traditionally, historically, although I know some companies have been making efforts to change this, if you're from other places, so if you're from Latin America, from Africa, your ancestors were, your results are not as good. They're like broadly sub-Saharan African, or they might say, you know, West Africa, but you're not getting the particular like specific region. And so that's been an issue that I know 23andMe in particular has been trying to recruit more people for its reference populations, both to give better estimates in terms of their ethnicity estimates, but also because they're researching disease and things like that. And you can't really give robust answers if you're not representing huge facets of the population.
Aren't there some countries too where it's, I don't know, forbidden is the right word, but it's, you know, it's discouraged to do DNA testing?
Yeah, I mean, I think like, I know that there's been some issues in France, some legal issues over whether, you know, whether the kits should be available. In Germany, I understand from just word of mouth that some Germans feel like DNA testing is like the opposite of what we should be doing, right? Isolating difference in genetics sounds kind of creepy when you think about World War II. And so, and understandably so. And I there's a couple chapters in the book on race and ethnicity and questions about, you know, is this encouraging us to think differently about one another in good ways or bad? Are we kind of reifying ideas of race? Are we strengthening sense of the sense of genetic difference and reinforcing our sense of separateness? Or are we being encouraged to see commonalities because now people are finding that, oh, you know, I see the diversity within myself. Like I did not know that I was 2%, whatever. And as I said earlier, that's something that they have not been able to answer that question, but they've been researching it. There's a Wendy Roth, who's a sociologist at University of Pennsylvania, says that the key difference from her research seems to be genetic literacy. So if you go into a DNA test with an understanding of what the test is, what genetics is, and what the test can tell you and what it can't, it tends to lessen sense of genetic difference. If you go in with less genetic literacy and not really an idea of what this is telling you, maybe you weren't paying attention in high school biology or whatever, it can actually do the opposite. It may strengthen sense of basically of racial difference and kind of make people feel that we're more different from one another than we are. I think I went off. I don't know if I answered your question or if I just went off on a complete non sequitur.
I remember seeing a program several years ago, and I'm thinking it might have been, was it National Geographic that was doing genetic testing? They were recruiting people to do genetic, you know, DNA testing in order to show that we all come from the same basic genetic material and we're all basically one family. Do you recall?
Is it maybe the Genographic project from National Geographic?
That could have been it.
Yeah, then they just stopped running it. I want to say like last year.
Oh.
I mean, I think that was the first DNA test that both of my parents took. And it could tell you about ancient migration paths.
Yes, that was it. Has there been anything written? Did they come up with a summary or, you know, write?
I think they did a lot of research on it over the years. I mean, it was running for over 10 years. I think it was, I want to say it was started in 2005 maybe, and it was running till 2018 or 2019.
Maybe they just haven't gotten around to publishing it yet.
I think if you look on the website for the Genographic project, there's some findings and some research that they did.
Thank you.
Yeah. Spencer Wells was the director.
Scott, did you have a question, Scott? No?
Yeah, I wanted to ask Libby if she found any surprises when she had her DNA tested, and whether in the research of this book, it changed the way you looked at yourself and changed the way you initially looked at your results.
Yes, yes, and yes. So we had like some really neat experiences through DNA testing. We discovered kind of close cousins on both sides, my maternal and paternal side. So in the case of my dad's side, his grandmother came over from Sweden in the 1890s, and we were in the databases, and we found not a ton of people test in Sweden. It's not like it is here, but it so happens that our genetic family there's a member of the family who's like a serious genealogist, and she was in a couple of the databases, and we matched with her, and it turned out that her mother is my dad's second cousin. So the second cousin doesn't sound that far away, but that relationship goes back, to the 1800s. That the origin of that connection, and these are people we would never have known if not for DNA, because there was a break in the line, so there would not have been paper records. Even though the Swedes kept great records, there would not have been. There was a guy who was a kind of a ne'er-do-well, and he was having lots of kids with different women. And so we actually traveled to Sweden in September, I want to say, last year, and we got to meet our relatives. We got to meet my dad's second cousin and his daughter, her daughter, the genealogist, and it was like remarkable. We hired a fixer. Actually, we didn't hire him. He was a local genealogist who we just took him out to dinner. He was just delighted to have someone who was interested in his research on this particular county in southern Sweden. And he was so excited. He did all this research on my dad's grandmother, and he showed us her, the foundation of the farmhouse where she lived, her school, and her church. And we were able to see a piece of furniture that had been in her family and touch it. Like it was amazing. And I think what that drove home to me was like the immediacy of the past, right? The past, 1890 seems like a very long time ago. I can't relate to that experience. I can't relate to having been born before cars and planes. And yet the past shapes us now, right? The past is shaping us in this moment. And sometimes it takes a DNA test to show us how present the past is still. And sometimes it's because it's a disruptive fact, something we're not expecting, that's reshaping us. And sometimes it's just access to the past and the immediacy of the past that we didn't know. And now we kind of have it. You asked me two questions. You said, did I discover anything? And then, did it surprise me, or did I start thinking? So here's what I kind of think about often, and I found myself thinking about it a lot when I was writing the book. So people are selective in their interpretations of their genetic results. Sometimes, and this has been borne out by research, sometimes they'll get really excited about a particular finding, like I'm 2% Moroccan, and totally dismissive of something else because it doesn't fit with the narrative, or it's boring, or they're just not compelled by it. They don't find it interesting. And I think, there's a tendency to think that that's kind of silly. But at the same time, if you look back at the history of genealogical research, we've always been selective about the pieces that we identify with and the pieces that we don't. And part of that has to do with culture. So you'll see people doing their research, and there's a branch of ne'er-do-wells, and they just kind of leave that branch off of their tree. Right? Don't want to be associated with those people. And by the same token, people who do DNA testing for often very valid reasons will, if they discover something, say that they discover their genetic father and he's, I don't know, Italian, they may not think of themselves as half Italian, even though genetically they are, because they very much identify with how they were raised. Or they may embrace it. But you know, these kind of decisions about what we embrace and what we claim are very complicated. And they're not, you know, that doesn't mean that they're wrong. So for me, for instance, I'm half Ashkenazi Jewish, but like, I just think of myself as Jewish, right? Not because I don't love my dad, because I do very much, but like, I don't know, it's just part of who I am, the way, it's important to me, the way I was raised. It's complicated. Like I could talk about it for an hour and you'd be bored, but like, there's a lot of reasons why I identify that way. And that doesn't mean that I'm wrong, right? And so is that an argument for, experience over biology? No, it's not. Because on the other hand, I can tell you a story of a man in my book who didn't know he was part Black until he was in his early 50s. And the reason he didn't know is because his mother told him that they were Sicilian, because she was trying to protect him from the genetic discrimination that she had felt as a biracial child growing up in Vermont in the middle of the century. And, you know, it was only through DNA and genealogical research he discovered he's 18% sub-Saharan African, and answered all these questions for him. And there's this passage, I actually wanted to read it, and I left it off for time, but I'll just read it now. Because I think it's really important. If somebody says, for instance, like, what does it matter? You were raised Sicilian. He's never Sicilian, by the way. Like, what does it matter that your biology is this thing? Why not just proceed as if you didn't know these results? And it matters a great deal. And he says, hang on a second, I'll see if I can find it. His name is Rosario Castronovo, which is a very Italian name that he adopted in homage to his supposed Sicilian ancestry when he changed his name years ago. He's not Italian at all, though. I write, Rosario struggles with how to think about himself and how to present himself to the world. It's kind of weird for a guy who presents as white to say, I'm Black, Rosario said. I'm still getting used to it. Could he even claim Blackness, he wondered, without that lived experience and without any of the implications of what it means to be perceived as a Black man in contemporary America? I'll never know what it's like to be pulled over by a police officer and fear for my life, he said. Can I call myself Black and never have to experience it? It almost seems unfair, or like I'm pandering. Yet his mother's elderly cousin, who is more fair-skinned than he, and according to her DNA results, has less African ancestry than his mother, is quite clear in her identity as a Black woman. It's a social construct, Rosario told me. I raised myself as an Italian man. I immersed myself in Italian culture. What do I do now? We were talking on Independence Day, and Rosario told me the more history he learned about his Black family, about the lives of Black people in Vermont and in the rest of America, the more he wondered what he should be celebrating on this day, and if he should be celebrating at all. I have learned more about African American history in this country, and the more granular you get, the more bitter you become, he said. I never got to know my people. And yet, genetic genealogy had also given him an opportunity to know about what had been hidden, to wrestle with his mother's pain, with his grandparents' sacrifices, and with the wrongs done to his family. DNA testing had given back to him and to his mother a little of what was stolen from the past. And I think that Rosario is a good kind of person to think about, and his experience is important because it kind of counters people who say, you know, what does it matter? In many ways, DNA testing, as painful as it is, and as difficult as it is, leading to incredibly difficult conversations, it's a reckoning. It's a moment of reckoning for many families. And you know, there's truths that we're discovering now, and we all have to kind of square our shoulders and sort of, you know, reckon with the past as it really was.
Question again. Do individuals do targeted matching? For example, my father used to talk about Virginia, and on one of the places on my DNA, it says Virginia. So can you ask DNA to look for potential matches in Virginia to see whether or not there was a long-term tie there somewhere? I get a list of all kinds of names.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about my results. Like when I look at my results at the major companies, people will usually list like birthplace of their birthplaces and their relatives' birthplaces. Have you ever seen that?
To some extent, yes. Okay. The initial list that I get of people that are closest to me are all Italian for some reason. And the blacks to whom I know that I'm related to, fall down as fourth and fifth cousins. And I know they're like second cousins. And I say, who are these other people?
That is interesting. It's interesting. Wow, that's really interesting. And well above my pay grade.
Okay. I related more to being Yemeni than I did to being Sicilian.
Well, that's interesting. Can you hear me, Libby?
Yeah, I can hear you, Alicia.
Okay, I was just thinking out loud. Well, he said he's 25% Italian from his DNA. That means one of his family members, one of his parents was 50% Italian. So I don't know his name, but you must.
Castle's not.
I don't know which one of your parents was half Italian, but you.
I didn't think either was, but.
Well, that's interesting. I think you need to explore that a little bit more, actually.
Well,
You've got some work to do there. That's interesting.
Yeah.
specifically Sicilian.
Right.
Did
Definitely.
you take Ancestry? Did you take the Ancestry DNA test?
Yes. Yes.
Do you know how to use the shared matches comparisons? And
Yeah, I get those. I've got a whole list, and the first several names, all of Italian names, etc. They're all from Louisiana, where I'm from, which is interesting.
But you don't know any of them.
No.
Okay.
do they
Well-
have family trees attached?
Yeah, but when I look at their trees, they're all Italian names primarily, right? So it's like Italians that marry Italians.
Do you see matches from your father and mother that you grew up with on there? I mean, do you see?
I see matches from my father's side.
What about your mother's side?
I've not. That's more French than anything.
And have you done the genealogy yourself? Have you followed a paper trail yourself?
Oh, yeah. I go back to my great-grandfather. I've got his 1882 marriage license and all of that stuff.
Uh-huh.
But
Maybe-
I can't go back further than that.
Maybe it would be of interest to you to sit down with a genealogist. I don't know where you live, or
I live in Rochester.
oh, you're in
New York.
Rochester. Yeah, maybe
Pittsburgh.
where the local library there, somebody can help
Yeah.
you with understanding your matches and so forth. It sounds a little mysterious to me, and sounds like you're a little confused about it yourself.
Well, it's just interesting. Each time I get an update, it's different.
Yeah, yeah.
Do any of the Italians have big family trees?
It seems like it's one primarily Italian family that that they're related to each other, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
And you're related to them some way.
Yeah, you are.
Is
Well,
there anybody that you know that
no.
there's
I
nobody?
prefer the
that you know
Yemeni
that's
because I thought
related
I
to
was an
them?
Ethiopian prince, but then that was blown up.
Oh, I knew your cousin must write to me all the time.
So anyway,
Because what you ought to do is start going back on the Italians and see if you can find a place where you possibly could fit in.
yeah.
There's techniques to doing that that you might look at with adoptees. You know, just pretend you're an adoptee and start going back.
And there's a large Latter-day Saints temple here that do a lot of genealogy.
And they'll help you.
I've gone there a couple of times.
Well, Bill,
And they're very good.
if you need some help, Bill, I'm going to pop my email address in there, and I know some really good people that probably could help you out with this stuff.
Okay, great.
Pop it in there right now. And I work with a lot of people that do genealogy, and see if I spelled it right there.
Well, you sent it to me, I think.
Oh, I did. How do I go back to everyone, Libby?
Here, if you go into that little blue bubble, but here, I'll just send it for you.
Okay.
If you don't mind everyone getting it.
I didn't
I
know.
see it.
Just
Oh, I got
someone to email.
I have some people I partner with the nonprofit that I think will be happy to volunteer and help you out, Bill.
Okay, good.
So pop me an email and we'll discuss it later.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Genealogists rock.
If you think of anything later on and you'd like to get in touch with someone, just send me an email and I'll try to put you in touch. Or
Sure, thank you.
whatever.
Very good.
All right. Well,
Very
I
helpful.
think I'm going to go put my kids to bed.
Yeah, about that time.
I'm gonna go walk my dog because she's mad at me.
Very dark here. That I know it's you know, you're West Coast, so you're just enjoying the light.
Yeah. well,
Coming.
I just
Pitch
wanted
dark
to
here.
say hi to Alice. Alice, your story is amazing. I read Libby's book, and it's really nice to meet you here.
Thanks. I don't believe it myself, but it really happened.
It did indeed.
Yeah, it's a hell of a story.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. And
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay, bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thanks.